Hi, psyc250 students. We're back with chapter 13. And last time we were talking about gender dysphoria. I wanted to share a case study with you, who's one of many cases from one of my favorite book titles of all time. It's called I'm Not Crazy, I Just Lost My Glasses. And this is Joan Scruggs. And I'd like to read you the story of Joan Scruggs, if I can get the image up there. It said, I was 2 years old, and I remember saying, am I a boy or a girl? My mother said, well, you're a boy, of course. And this immense feeling came over me. Something incredibly wrong. I prayed I would wake up some morning and be a girl. Started going steady in high school, and in a very innocent childhood exploration, she got pregnant. I was 17, and we got married. We were married for 27 years. I told her I had this fascination to wear girls' clothes. She didn't want to talk about it, even got violent. So it was held for 27 years in utmost secrecy within my heart. 6 years ago, my wife left, the children were grown, and my wife gone, I had a right to live my life. I worked in broadcasting engineering for 30 years. I was on vacation and had it announced that I would be returning to work as a woman. It's been a tremendous stress on me to walk down the halls and be Joan when they've known John for 50 years. Do you understand the futility to where I am? I want to have been a little girl. The best I can ever hope for is a very good imitation. There comes a point unconsciously when you give up. 10 weeks ago, I had this terrible feeling of despair, and I took a bottle of sleeping pills. In the hospital, I suddenly realized I'd been admitted as a female. It was the most beautiful thing that ever happened to me. I got up in the morning as a woman, went to breakfast as a woman. I was even there for 2 weeks, and I didn't want to leave. I make $40,000 a year, and I'm in good health. Most people would say, my God, you've got everything. I don't have a damn thing. The number one thing that runs in my life is sexual identity. And its nature tampers with that. It can lead to despair. The operation is only a tiny part of the whole program. Things will be rearranged, reshaped, and put back the way they should have been. Once I have my operation, I am no longer a transsexual. When you leave the hospital, you are a woman. So I wanted to share the case of Joan Scruggs, not related to the Joan case I mentioned earlier, just one person's perspective of what it's like to live a life that's very confusing. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this character. The character's name is Pat. It's an old Saturday Night Live gag, and the name of the character is called Androgynous Pat, where Pat was the kind of person you meet and you're not sure of their gender, and rather than offending them and calling him he or her, you try to figure it out. And that was a running gag of Pat, that nobody could ever figure out their gender. And of course, at the time, it was just silly because today, most people wouldn't even care. But here's a picture of Pat naked, and you think, okay, for sure, I'll know what Pat's gender is, and you can't quite see Pat, so that doesn't really give it away. Here's a picture of Pat as a baby, and that doesn't give it away either. And finally, we get to meet Pat's partner. We think, well, that might give us a clue. And there's Pat's partner, which the partner's name is Chris. And of course, that just makes it even more confusing because Chris happens to be also androgynous, right? This notion that if you talk to Pat, Pat would say, I'm really into gourmet cooking. And you think, female, right? When I'm not fixing the car, male. And of course, we know it's silly because men and women can do both very easily. Right. Let's move on to what I like to call our paraphiliac disorders, or I like to call them paraphilias. I usually draw a couple hands on the board, and I ask people, why do a couple hands have anything to do with paraphilias? And of course, these are a pair, two, of philias. All right, it's a bad joke. Paraphilias are a wide open range of different disorders. And I know the print's really hard to see in this, and it's kind of hard to read. But basically, it gets very complicated as to, again, as we addressed in the first video, how do we determine if something is abnormal, a paraphilia, a very distinct behavior that doesn't meet the criteria of the norm. Let me give an example. Have you ever noticed that maybe a pair of your underwear is missing? Maybe you can only find one of two shoes. Well, this could be a result of a fetish disorder. In other words, there are some folks that collect articles of clothing and sometimes steal them from other individuals. A prime example might be you go to the laundromat, you decide to wash your clothing, and your underwear is stolen. You thought you might have thrown it in the washer, and when you took things out of the dryer, it was gone. But chances are the person with the fetish disorder needs your soiled underwear, not clean. They could just go to the store and buy that. And they need that to gain sexual gratification. I know it sounds a little strange, but think about all those socks we went missing over the years. Who knows, right? Transvestic disorder involves not just dressing in the opposite gender, which is very difficult to do these days because we have a free, open society where people can wear all kinds of clothing and nobody really questions them for the most part, right? But getting sexual gratification by wearing the opposite gender's clothing, that's what we're talking about, right? And of course, some clothing is hidden. So I'd like to share my case study today, and it's called The Flasher, and it deals with an exhibitionist disorder, right? An exhibitionist disorder. A voyeur disorder is, watching people getting undressed or perhaps engage in a sexual activity, not really necessarily wanting contact with them, but just getting gratification by watching them. Whereas an exhibitionist is the stereotypic male, and of course males are overrepresented with the paraphilic disorders, probably because when we have men that display their genitals rather shockingly to shock their victims, if we had a woman do that, it's not often as reported. Imagine being a male going to the police station and say, a woman just flashed her genitals to me. And the reaction, although hopefully in 2020 it's a little bit better, but the reaction might be just laughter, like, why are you here? Why are you reporting that? Where it should be treated equally, whether it's male or female reporting, whatever the violation happens to be. So let me tell you about the flasher. I was assigned to an individual who actually was incarcerated at the time. He had been a client of the agency I worked at, and the agency is an agency I mentioned in the past called Cristo Rey. And so I went to the jail and I had to show identification. Of course, I had to make an appointment in advance. And they let me into his jail cell. And the reason he was incarcerated because he was arrested for flashing his genitals to 3 female victims. So I asked him for the details, and he told me that he had been drinking some alcohol. He got into his older model convertible car, and the typical thing he would do was go to a red light or a stop sign, and if he saw some females around where he was driving, he would beep and kind of wave them over. This is exactly what happened. It's a red light. He was at this red light. There are no other cars around. The 3 females talking with one another. He beeped his horn. Now, let me describe this individual a little bit to you. He looked a little bit like Brad Pitt. Long hair, slim build, Caucasian, in his mid-20s. He beeped the horn, waved them over. They came to see what's going on. And at that point, he had a blanket over his lap. He took the blanket off, revealing that he had no clothing below the waist. They screamed. By this time, hopefully, the lights turn green. He takes off. Now, the thrill of this activity is to shock your victim, right? If there's no shock, if the person is like yawning, is that it? That kind of thing, that's not going to give any gratification to the exhibitionists. They want more shock. These women were shocked, but one of them took the time to write down his license number. Now, he had gotten in trouble for these activities before, so it didn't take too long for the police to put two and two together and arrest him. While he was telling me this story, and by the way, he was employed as a graphic artist. He had a long-term relationship with his girlfriend. Now he's incarcerated, out of work, possibly not able to get his job back. His relationship's in peril. And I asked him, why would you do this? And his response was, I don't know. And I also asked him, is it possible that you set yourself up? In other words, you wanted to be caught, that you don't really want to do this behavior. And he said, why would you say that? Well, think about the particulars. He gets intoxicated first. He's not thinking very straight. His planning ability isn't great. Why he's stuck at the stop sign or the red light? Of course, somebody's going to ultimately catch him. He doesn't try to hide his identity in any form or fashion. He doesn't try to change his license plate number, nothing of that nature. So I think if we go to the behavioral school, we could argue that, well, it provides a great reinforcement, and that's why he continues to do this behavior. But if we look a little deeper, we might say he doesn't really want to do this. He really wants to stop, because sometimes the court has to get involved. Have you ever been stuck in a crowded bus or subway? Then chances are, or a train for that matter, you might have been a victim of frauditistic disorder. A frauteur is somebody who looks for crowded situations so they can rub up against you, and you're not even aware that this is happening because the situation is so crowded. Mama told us when we were growing up not to talk to strangers. We know that pedophiles are typically people that we know, that we trust, in positions of power or positions of trust, which is so tragic, especially when we see institutions, whether it's universities, whether it's churches, that attempts to hide the perpetrators, move them to other areas, and thus opens up the possibility that they can victimize even more and more people. That's just a tragedy. I think hopefully with this new generation, we will stand up and fight for people's rights and believe them and believe that they are victims of these perpetrators. I want to give you a couple questions from chapter 13, that will be on this exam. And the first question deals with the case study I just talked about, the flasher. I want you to describe the case study in detail, as well as the diagnosis. And anytime I ask for a diagnosis, of course, I want you to fill in why they fit the diagnosis. And the last one is to discuss the issue of gender dysphoria. How does it get started? What role does society play in this disorder? Hopefully, this has been an interesting lecture for you, and looking forward to talking more when I cover chapter 14. Thank you.